Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our live Q&A session for Viome. We are very excited to have you here, and thank you to everyone for all the questions that you sent in. We have received some amazing questions, which we are very excited to talk to you about. And I would like to introduce you to Rob. He is our account manager over in the US at Viome. He has got an exceptional amount of knowledge about Viome, and he is going to be here to answer all your questions. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we hope you have an interesting session. As I said, we have received a lot of questions, but if you've got questions that come up as we go along, please do pop it through to us, and we will be sure to answer your question at the end. Great, so what I'm going to do is we had a couple of general questions just about Viome, and some of them were, how is the test done? Does the test tell you what foods to avoid? Does it explain to you what you should eat? Does it tell you the current state of your health? So we thought maybe what the best thing to do would be for Rob maybe just to give us a brief background and understanding of what Viome is, and then we can get into your questions. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Shelly, and thanks for setting this up. I'm always thrilled anytime I get to chat with you guys. I guess we'll start at a high level. So I think in 50 years from now, people will look back today at the current healthcare system and just feel that it was barbaric in the way that we wait for disease to be symptomatic and to be full force before we even decide to do anything about it, and at which point you can really only manage or try to contain symptoms to some degree. And so really what it is that we're doing at Viome is, look, we finally have the technology to look at the human body, to understand not only, what is your DNA, because your DNA doesn't change, it's what are your cells and your microbiome actually doing at any given point in time, and then saying, all right, based on that, here are nutritional and supplement interventions that you can do today to hopefully prevent or in some cases reverse chronic disease. And that, 5, 10, 20 years from now, that will be the standard of care, that we will be constantly looking at how our body is functioning and course correcting along the way so that we can avoid these chronic diseases, which today we just view as an inevitability when that does not need to be the case going forward. So to zero in a little bit, what does Viome specifically do at this point in time? And Shelly, just confirm for me, can you see a screen with the Viome logo and a lady with her arms up?
Indeed, yes.
All right, perfect. So what Viome does essentially today is we are a microbiome test. And the reason that we started there, because the technology itself has the ability to look at any cell in the human body, whether it's mitochondrial or your immune cells, or in this case, your microbial cells, and understand how is that cell functioning. And the reason we started with the microbiome is because you have trillions of microbes in there that are intricately connected to your overall health. 60% of your immune system is surrounding the gut. Your 90% of your serotonin is produced in the microbiome. Neurotransmitters, hormones, all of these things, a lot of them occur starting in the gut and are impacted by what do we eat. So that's where we started as a testing company to figure that out. And what you really get, and I apologize that we're kind of skipping through the slide deck here, but what Viome is many of the viewers probably know, it's an at-home test. It's really not much more complicated than that. And it's an at-home stool test where we're then able to send that sample to the lab and then look at what your microbiome is doing. How is it functioning? Are there inflammatory activity going on? Is there healthy activity going on? And then what should you be eating, or what supplements should you be taking to improve that overall system and by extension your overall health? And so in a nutshell, once you've purchased the at-home test, you've completed it, you complete a questionnaire as well in conjunction with that. And then all of that stuff gets, the sample information gets put through the AI along with the questionnaire. Then all of your results and your food recommendations appear in the app on your phone. And so what customers see is something like this. So when you log into the app, here's your home screen, and what it's going to break down for you is simply, you know, from, I guess we'll start at the top left, what foods should you be avoiding or minimizing? In a lot of cases, these are foods that you would associate with perfect health. Kale, spinach, lentils, generally healthy foods that you personally probably should be either not eating or eating at a much reduced rate. Next to that, we have at the opposite end of the spectrum, what are your unique superfoods? And that term, I think, gets thrown around a lot. Avocado is a superfood, or acai bowls are a superfood, or whatever it is. And the reality is, at the level of the individual, that stuff may or may not hold true. That at the level of the individual, you have specific foods that are your superfoods. And, this can be blueberries, it can be, cauliflower, or those foods could absolutely be on your avoid list. So it's really personalized to you. In the bottom left-hand corner, there are supplement recommendations. And these are things that, you can certainly get a lot of your nutrition from food, but in certain cases, it might be helpful to have a little bit, just frankly, extra help with some of these nutritional needs. And then lastly, in the bottom left is just all of your foods. So that's like, I talk about it like the Google for your personal foods. You basically can type in any food that's out there, and it will tell you, should you be enjoying this food, minimizing it, or maybe avoiding it. So that's the food recommendations, and that's what people get most excited about. The other piece of information that we show are your gut results. So you submitted a sample of your microbiome, and the lab is going to break that down by what is your microbiome doing right now, how is it functioning, and then it's going to simplify all of that information into 20 microbiome scores. And here's some examples of those, protein fermentation, inflammatory activity, metabolic fitness being how well do you handle sugars and carbs, and do you easily store those as fat? Do they create inflammation, or do you process them well? And then again, even if you process carbs well, there may be some carbs that you don't process as well as others, and that may create a glycemic spike or a blood sugar spike, and then an energy crash. So in a nutshell, that is what Viome does. We're really looking at this core system of the microbiome, which in our opinion is the cornerstone of health, figuring out what it's doing, what does it need to be healthy, and then providing those options for people to then go out and eat and live a better lifestyle to prevent or reverse chronic disease. So I just rambled there for a while. I'm going to pause, turn it back to Shelly, and maybe we can I can elaborate on some more stuff, or we can get into those questions that you guys submitted.
Perfect. Thanks, Rob. I think you've given a great overview of Viome and what you can expect if you do the test. So I think that was fantastic, and we can definitely get into the questions. So I've got a list here, so I'll just run through them, and you can answer them as we go. So one of the first ones is, how long does it take to change the microbiome in your gut?
Great question. And I'm glad that whoever wrote that recognizes that the microbiome does change, and that the food recommendations and the scores that you get on your first test are not forever, that these things do change over time. When you change your diets, let's say you did the test, you got your Viome recommendations, you start eating this way, it takes about 6 to 12 weeks for your microbiome to adjust to that new diet. And what that means is the behavior of the microbiome changes, the relative abundance of some of these different microbes will change, and hopefully inflammation gets better, and some of these scores improve along the way. And then to your, I guess the next step would be, then retesting, because after your microbiome has now changed, your food recommendations may change a little bit.
Fantastic, thank you. And then the next question is, should you stop taking supplements before doing the test? And maybe you can also then add in, should you stop taking any medication as well? Just to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly no need to stop any supplementation, and definitely don't stop any medication that you're on without chatting with your doctor first. The reality is the supplements and the medication that you're currently on will have an impact on your microbiome. And so stopping that is going to change the microbiome and throw off all kinds of stuff. And who knows, if you're on those supplements or medications for a reason. Probably don't want to tweak that. So stay on, the recommendation of our science team is whatever you're taking currently, stay on it. The microbiome will reflect, or the test will reflect what's going on in your microbiome and accommodate for those food recommendations.
Brilliant. And then we've also just got a question that came through, which is related to this. How long after antibiotics should you do the test?
Oh, that's such a great question. So antibiotics will absolutely screw up the test. I have tested this on myself. It will, if you've been on antibiotics, we recommend that you wait 4 to 6 weeks before retesting, because effectively what you've done, Shelley, is you've wiped out your entire microbiome, and any results that we get back from that test before it's able to rebound will not be a good representation. Your scores just go all over the place.
That is good to know, and definitely something that I think happens. I mean, after you've had a course of antibiotics, I know I definitely notice a change, in my gut. So, as you say, a very good question.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to add one more piece, because this is typically the follow-up to that. Once you've been on antibiotics, people ask, should I be taking probiotics after the fact? What should I be doing to amplify or expedite that rebound of my gut in a healthy way? And probiotics can be good, but the concerning part is you're then introducing 10 to 14 different types, which relative to the thousands of different microbes you normally have in your gut, is a very small amount. The better approach is to eat a lot of different foods and really feed the diverse colony of your microbiome as well as you can, so that everything grows back evenly, rather than trying to introduce new stuff.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. So the next question is, how old do you need to be to do this test? What about children? If you test children, from what age can you do that?
All right, and I'm looking at myself, and I don't know if I'm freezing or delayed, but I'm gonna give my camera a rest for a moment here. When it comes to ages, we've had customers have kids as young as 2 years old do the test, and that is absolutely fine, and in a lot of cases can provide some great insights. Younger than 2 years old, the microbiome is really still being formed, and the food recommendations may not be as beneficial as for somebody who's, say, 5, 10, or certainly older than 20. So bottom line is, you can certainly we have plenty of kids that get sequenced every year, but probably not younger than 2.
Brilliant, thank you. Then the next question is, how can this help with IBS?
So IBS is a space, and actually I'm going to expand that to say IBD, any irritable bowel disease, whether it's colitis or Crohn's or any of these things. Nutrition plays such a key role in those diseases and those illnesses. And actually, this is a good opportunity to point out that when you look at somebody because there's a lot of DNA tests out there making recommendations to the nutrition of individuals. when you look at someone who has Crohn's or colitis and they have a flare-up of their IBD, and their colon, if you look at it on a medical photograph, looks terrible. It's inflamed, it's red, there can be scarring. It's really, it looks terribly painful, quite frankly. And then you look at that same person when they're not having a flare up and it looks perfectly healthy, their DNA in both of those instances is the same. It hasn't changed. It is simply what genes are being expressed. And the microbiome expresses way more genes than our human body does. And so feeding that system appropriately for its uniqueness makes a massive difference in just general inflammation for almost anybody. And that can be much more profound in the case of IBS. And actually, this may not mean as much to your group, but here in the States, we've partnered with Mayo Clinic, United Healthcare, GSK, who's the world leader in vaccines. And a lot of the research that we're doing is directly tied to IBD, different irritable bowel diseases. And that's where we've had, frankly, the most success. So in a nutshell, yes, Viome and the nutritional recommendations can have a big impact on that space.
Amazing, thank you. And then, so this kind of links in with it, but how can following your recommendations help with autoimmune conditions? Things like maybe Crohn's or Hashimoto's, something like that. Does Viome help with that?
So, very much like IBD, autoimmune is a function of the cells misbehaving. They're expressing in a way that they shouldn't be. And autoimmune, it is a malfunction of the immune system. Well, Shelley, 60% of our immune system is literally lining the gut. And if you have leaky gut, meaning that food particles or pathogens are able to get into the bloodstream or to cross over and activate those immune cells, or the immune cells are just constantly activated because they feel that they're constantly under attack, even though they may not be. All of those things relate to chronic inflammatory responses. So when you think of somebody who has a gluten allergy or even like an MS or some sort of other autoimmune, the immune cells just aren't functioning the way that they should be. And tracking that back to the gut, that is the core on-off switch for the immune system and to keep it running functionally. So without question, diet seems to play a huge role in autoimmune diseases, and understanding the system of the microbiome and feeding it appropriately can absolutely have a tremendous impact on those symptoms.
Brilliant, thank you. And then also, can you comment on the gut's connection to things like anxiety and depression?
Sure. So I touched on it earlier, but 90% of your serotonin, which is like the feel-good hormone, is not produced in the brain, it's produced in the gut. And when it comes to a whole host of your neurotransmitters, they're made in the gut, they're not made in the brain. And the connection between those two, between the gut and the brain, is something called the vagus nerve. It's like this superhighway that runs back and forth sending signals. And your gut is sending 9 times as many signals to your brain as your brain is to your gut. And so, and the easiest way to think about this is if you've ever had a lunch that just didn't agree with you, and then you go back to the office and you have to sit in meetings, and you feel foggy and you just don't feel like yourself and you're not mentally clear, that is a function of dysbiosis in the gut impacting your mood, behavior, energy levels at a cognitive level. And so if you're not on a daily basis, if you're not eating in conjunction with your gut, if you're eating things that are inflammatory for you or that are causing backlash, you're doing this to yourself at some level every day. And that compounds over time. So without question, and frankly, here's what else is interesting. Our science team looks at what we call cohorts, groups of people that have a certain symptom. And they look at groups that have depression or anxiety, and they look at their microbiome, and what's fascinating, this is anecdotal, it hasn't been in a paper yet, but they see without question huge similarities between those people, despite the fact that they're all over the world. Different cities, different environments, but same symptoms, very similar microbiome activity. And so obviously nutrition can play a big role there.
That's fascinating, and I think it's amazing to be able to see that data and to see the correlation between, as you say, people from all over the world that suffer from depression and anxiety, showing very similar traits in their microbiome.
Yeah, hopefully with the advent of big data and the ability to be able to compare people all over the world, I think it'll be fascinating to see people finding others like themselves and then finding a solution to whatever their ailment is when they feel that they're so isolated, nobody else has this problem, and yet there's people all over the world with the same problem. And by the way, the microbiome activity looks very, very similar from person to person.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. I think we've got some pregnant people in our audience, so I'll try and group some of these questions together. But is one's gut microbiome affected by pregnancy, and should you wait to test until after you've had your baby? And then, okay, then I'll ask the other question after this.
So without question, there is a pretty sizable change in the microbiome during pregnancy, which is probably not surprising because so many other things change. I think I heard somebody say once that your hormones will double every 3 days in the first trimester, which like blew my mind. So, I mean, the body now has a foreign entity in it. Your entire immune system changes to accommodate that, along with hormones and everything else. As it relates to testing, we certainly think it would be beneficial for people to test during pregnancy, as long as you recognize that from trimester to trimester and certainly postnatal, your tests are going to look probably pretty dramatically different. But I'll say this, to this day, the best results I have ever seen by an individual were a woman in her second trimester, which her husband is a professional athlete, and he's been working on his gut and certainly gotten much better. But when I said to her, this is the best I've ever seen, by the way, don't tell your husband because I know how competitive he is, she immediately goes, she reaches across the table, they're at lunch, had to share that she was the best. So my guess is pregnancy certainly played a role in how good those results looked, but again, it's going to change trimester to trimester.
Brilliant, thanks. And then maybe a good question after that is how often, I mean, not for women that are pregnant, but how often should you be testing your microbiome? So you did say that, it takes about 90 days in order to see a difference, but in terms of ongoing testing of your microbiome, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so it takes about 90 days for the full change to occur. You should probably start to notice a difference in feel at about the 4 to 6 week mark. But pregnant women aside, think about it this way. You test the first time, you follow the food recommendations for 90 days, you allow that first change to occur, and then you retest. Your foods will shift a little bit. Hopefully most of your scores do improve. And then after that, it becomes like going to the dentist. So once or twice a year, maybe every 6 months or so, check in, see how your gut is doing, see if you need to make any tweaks, because from over the course of 6 months, typically a lot changes, just in terms of our environment and things like that. If you've been on antibiotics, if you've been traveling extensively, maybe that becomes more than twice a year, but like going to the dentist.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob. We've also got a question about how much does the test cost, and then how much does a retest cost? So what we've done is the test costs 3,990 Rand in South Africa. That's inclusive of courier of the kit to your house, courier of the sample back to Viome in the US, as well as all your results. And then because we understand that it's very important to constantly check in on your microbiome, any test you do following your first test, so any retests, will be done at 3,490, so it's a 500 Rand discount. So yeah, just trying to provide some kind of discounts in order to be able to allow you to test, as Rob says, as regularly as you'll go to the dentist. Perhaps maybe more regularly than that, depending how often you go to the dentist. But yeah, just for a good check-in. And then Rob, we've got a question here. Can this test help with something like endometriosis? And then sort of also on that is, would having recently gone through IVF, so having all sorts of additional medicines and hormones, would it be advisable to do a test straight after that? Would you wait a while like you would with antibiotics? Maybe I should have split those questions. Maybe we can start with the endometriosis first.
Sure. So let's start there. So again, I am not a doctor, certainly not an OBGYN or whoever would handle endometriosis. But when it comes to, my understanding of that condition is that it's a malfunction of the cells or the placement of cells and the expression of cell division. That is a function of, or I should say, it can be a function of something called epigenetics. So epigenetics is simply the question of how does your environment, everything from how you're sleeping to where you're living to what you're eating, impact your genetic expression. And what that means is, people who have the gene for Alzheimer's or for Parkinson's, or they're predisposed to diabetes, not all of these people get those diseases. So what is the function of why some people get it and others don't? In a lot of instances, it's a function of epigenetics. How is your environment impacting your gene expression? And a lot of that comes all the way back to nutrition. And so while I don't believe we've done any studies as it relates to endometriosis particularly, but with what we've done with autoimmune and some of these other cellular malfunctioning conditions, I do believe that nutritional interventions can have an impact there. But this is probably an instance where the science is so raw that working with your current doctor is probably the better first step, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Then maybe just the question with IVF. Rob, does having hormone treatment or medicines which help with IVF, would that greatly impact your microbiome?
It absolutely could. I wouldn't not get tested or delay testing, especially if you're going to continue that regimen going forward. So I don't know what this particular regimen would be, but if it's for 2 weeks, maybe hold off on the testing. But if this is going to be the new standard of care for 6-12 months, certainly no need to wait for that. But to answer your question, yes, it's likely that will impact what your microbiome is doing.
Brilliant. Now we've got a good question here about probiotics. So it says, what prebiotics and probiotics do you recommend for good health, for gut health? What foods boost it? And then a similar question was, if I eat kimchi, sauerkraut, etc., do I still need to buy probiotic pills?
Great question. So probiotics get a lot of hype and they can be beneficial, but what the science seems to indicate is they may not be as beneficial as people think. And here's why. It is incredibly challenging for a new microbe to make it through the stomach acid all the way down to the lower intestine, and to then find space to set up and colonize, and then become active and start doing proper things and dividing and such. And so most of the probiotics do not do what people think they're doing, where they're setting up camp and they're introducing new microbes into the environment. Most of the benefits that you get from a probiotic is, as it passes through the digestive system, you have what's called dendritic cells, which are basically like neighborhood watch. They're grabbing things in the environment and then telling the immune system, is this a pathogen? Is it a parasite? Or is it a food particle that's not really a problem? And because they're grabbing healthy bacteria, these dendritic cells, they're telling the immune system to relax. And so they're going to decrease inflammation at some level. But that requires then you're taking the probiotic every single day to maintain that benefit. In our opinion, and what the science seems to indicate is it is much better for overall microbiome health to properly feed the good microbes that you already have in your gut. It's much easier and it's much more bang for your buck. And that's where the prebiotics come in. Now, in terms of what is the best prebiotic for somebody, there's some research that indicates that resistant starches in sweet potatoes or plantains can be unbelievably helpful. But at the level of the individual, if you don't know how that food is going to impact your blood sugar or general inflammation or the specific types of microbes that you have, it's tough to say what is the best. It really, what is the best for you? And the only way to find that out is to test.
Absolutely. And what I can say from my side is that when you do the test, you are actually given the prebiotics, probiotics, supplements that you should be taking, which are right for your gut, which I think is really amazing. So as Rob has said, you may benefit from a certain prebiotic, whereas someone might not. And Viome takes the guesswork out of that for you. So you know exactly what you should be taking.
And to that end, Shelley, there are certainly people that don't get a supplement recommendation for probiotics or for prebiotics. So not necessarily everybody needs them. A lot of people can get what they need out of food alone.
Brilliant. Then a question here, how do the Viome results and process differ from a blood diet type of eating?
So the blood diet type of eating, when it comes to nutrition, we just talked about how complex this system of the microbiome is. You've got trillions of genes being expressed, trillions of different microbes doing all kinds of different stuff. It's very difficult to create a diet at the individual level. And so up to this point, based on limited technology, scientists and folks and nutritionists have tried to grab biomarkers that we understand, like a blood type, and then build a big bucket diet around that. And not to say that those diets cannot be great for certain people. I mean, this is why you see paleo diets and keto diets and vegetarian and vegans. And some of those diets work unbelievably well for certain people. And I think the same applies to the blood type diet, which I believe 4 blood types. I believe there's 4 types of diets there. But it's just a little bit limited in the scope because you're only looking at one biomarker and building around that with kind of limited information. So again, can be incredibly helpful. I know people that have gotten great benefit out of it, but it's a limited science when it comes to nutrition.
Great. And then there's a question here. Is the app and easy to use and other results easy to follow? I.e., is there a lot of jargon or a lot of science talk? Maybe you can, what do you think about it?
I will admit there is in the current iteration, which this is going to change in 3 to 4 weeks, there is some degree of science jargon in there and what I'll call term stacking. That said, I think that mostly applies to the microbiome scores. When you drill down into those and you read the explanation of what the score is, what does it mean to you? You look at the video explaining the score from our chief science officer. That can get a little bit into minutia. When it comes to the food recommendations, I think those are pretty straightforward. You've got 4 buckets. Superfoods, these are your A++ foods for you. You've got your enjoy bucket, which are somewhere between 50 and 200 foods for you that will be the core of your diet. You've got minimized foods, which I call moderation foods because they should not be avoided entirely. They should be mixed in on occasion, and then you have your avoid food, which are your personal kryptonite at the moment. And so when you think about, all right, cashews are an avoid food, what should I do with that? Well, you should probably avoid that until your next test. And if something's a superfood, go crazy, eat as much as you want. And if something's on the enjoy list, continue to enjoy it. So I think the food recommendations are a little bit more straightforward. The gut results can be a little bit in the weeds, but in 4 weeks, we are distilling the 20 gut scores into more simplistic high-level scores. So hopefully that makes life easier for folks.
I think that's going to be a very exciting change. But from my side, I've done the test and I've seen the recommendations. And as much as you say, Rob, there are the science aspects to it, and you can kind of delve in as deep as you want. But the recommendations of the food are really easy to follow. It's amazing. You've got it on your phone. When you go to the shops, if you think to yourself, oh goodness, what was my superfood? What is an avoid food? You can open your app, all the pictures are there with your food list. So it makes it really simple to use.
Yeah, and that is, for me personally as well, the number one thing I use in the app is all my foods, and just if there's something at a restaurant and I'm like, I wonder if this is good for me, I can just type it in and see, is it right for me or should I be minimizing or avoiding it?
Yeah, it's super handy having it just on your phone. Mm-hmm. And then we've got a good question here. How does your gut affect your facial skin with regards to pimples and acne?
I love that question personally because it definitely affected me. I would say that after IBD or IBS, the number, actually maybe in weight loss would be up there in the top 3 too. One of the top 3 things we hear is the improvement of skin from folks that follow their food recommendations. It is profound because effectively what acne is some combination of bad bacteria or bacteria behaving in an incorrect fashion on your face, or your immune cells incorrectly functioning, meaning they're attacking things that are not actually harmful to you. And so by calming the immune system at the level of the gut, you're calming your immune system everywhere, and certainly on the face. I'll give you 2 examples. So for me personally, I basically had like acne my entire life. I started doing Viome in 2017, and I've done God knows how many tests since then. One food that has always been on my avoid list was oats, and I, for the last decade, have loved oatmeal. I had it every day for breakfast, and every time that showed up on the avoid list, I said, I'm going to change everything else, but I'm not getting rid of my oatmeal. Eventually, last year, I got to a point where I felt great. This was the only food I couldn't get rid of. And so I said, I'm going to cut out the oatmeal for 6 weeks. And if I feel remarkably different and my skin looks remarkably different, well, by the way, I should be clear. The oats were on there. It gave me this explanation every time. Because of the high copper content in oats, it's not great for my skin. I continue to eat it anyway, though. So for 6 weeks, I decided I would cut it out. And if I felt remarkably different, I'd get rid of it forever. But anything less than remarkably better, and I would put it right back in. Unbelievable change within about 3 weeks. And since then, I have not had oats until this past weekend. I was camping in the mountains for 4 days. You had to bring dry food with you. There's only so many options. So I brought oats. And within 2 days, I got like a little blemish right here coming back from eating 4 days of oats. So it's such a pain in the ass, but yes, nutrition makes a big difference in the skin.
Good. It's very good to know, and important to follow those recommendations to keep a good looking skin. So Rob, we've got a question here from Claudia. So she submitted her sample, and obviously there's a waiting period from when you submit your sample to when you get your results. And she said, I did not start eating in accordance with her recommendations. Is that a problem? So obviously with the time gap, is it okay? You'll obviously only start eating according to recommendations maybe 2 weeks later.
So I guess I may have missed that. So she, I guess give me that
So
one more.
okay, so she submitted her results, well, submitted her sample, but has not yet received her results. So
Mhm.
she'll obviously receive her results in maybe 2 weeks. But what kind of change can happen in that time between doing the sample and getting your results?
Got it. Okay, great question. So we have done the studies with folks where we tested them over a course of a month. And we tested people every day, or sorry, every week. And we would test the tail, middle, and head of the sample, so to speak. And at the end of the month, we have basically 12 data points for every individual. And what we found is that in that short of a time period, there was minimal to no change in someone's microbiome if they did not change their diet dramatically. So it takes some time. So people always say, I'm waiting to do my test because, we went out this past weekend, I was, drinking and eating pizza and I want my gut to kind of rebalance. And the reality is it takes longer to throw you out of whack than one bad weekend, and it takes you longer than a couple weeks to get things going in the right direction. So it's kind of a slow process.
That is good to know, though. So then we've got a question here. Would this test be effective to use for children with eczema or something like ADHD?
So it's fascinating. One of our science staff members tells a story about because he was a practitioner for a long time, tells a story of a woman who comes in with her infant who had terrible eczema and was basically covered in this like really soft plush material and couldn't have anything exposed to the air basically. And every time the baby would cry during this meeting with the practitioner, she would put a little Purell on her finger and then put it in the baby's mouth, and was basically constantly putting antimicrobial, antiseptic into the baby's mouth at a time when the microbiome is supposed to be seeded and formed. And coincidentally, this poor child had just terrible eczema top to bottom. So kind of going back to the acne thing again, the skin is so intricately connected to the microbiome and what we eat and frankly how much water we're drinking. And so nutrition can absolutely make a big difference there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And a question also came up about can the test tell me if I'm drinking enough water?
I saw that. I wish that it could, because my general rule of thumb is none of us drink enough water. But yeah, nothing in the test is going to indicate how much water you need or are not getting.
Okay, then another question here is how accurate is the test? So I've heard that the stool testing is unreliable as the microbiome can be completely different depending on if you've taken the sample from the top, middle, or end of the stool. Is that true?
So we did that study, as I mentioned a little bit ago. We found, and so let me be clear, almost every other test out there is looking at relative abundance of the microbes. So how many of which type do you have? And then what are the ratios of those microbes? What we're looking at is what is the overall microbiome doing? Is it producing short chain fatty acids? Is it producing inflammatory molecules like ammonia or sulfide or any of these LPS that are not good for you? And when you look at function, you get a very clear resolution from person to person within a relative time span. So that's why we're able to get a more level representation of someone's microbiome on a regular basis, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So then we've also got a question here. How long does it take to get the test results? So what is the turnaround time from when the sample arrives at the lab to when we could expect results?
So from the time the sample arrives at the lab, we are averaging 9 days to releasing the results. So that, again, that's once we get it, coming from South Africa takes a little bit of time to get over the oceans, but once we have it, about 9 days. And then because it's digital, you get it basically instantly.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You'll receive a notification, an email will come through to let you know that your results are there. But just from our side, with the lockdown, the courier is taking a little bit longer because there are a lot fewer flights out to the US. So there is a slight delay in getting the samples to the US, but we'll get them there as quickly as possible. And then you will also be notified once the sample is safely in the US. So then let me just have a look here. How would the test benefit someone with type 1 diabetes?
So type 1 diabetes is interesting because it's so glycemic response dependent. And what we found, we did a study back in 2018 where we wanted to understand, how does food impact a particular person's blood sugar? And so what we did is we took 550 people, we had them wear a continuous glucose monitor for 2 weeks, so we knew exactly what their blood sugar was doing at any point in time. And then we went out to the Whole Foods. I don't know if you guys have that in South Africa, but it's a kind of luxury grocery store here in the States. And we purchased 27,000 meals for these folks so that everybody was eating the same thing. Oh, and then we partnered with an organization that had the ability to take a photograph of a plate of food and determine what was on that plate, what were the proportions. So we basically knew exactly what people were eating and then what their blood sugar was doing. And we, of course, sequenced the microbiomes. And what we found is that at the level of the individual, how you will respond to a banana or a slice of bread is completely different person to person based on your microbial activity. And that we can actually predict, when we know your microbial activity, how you're going to respond to a particular food. We were able to basically build that model. And so as it comes back to type 1 diabetes, I think right now, at least here in the States, the gold standard is net carbs, so relative carbs to fiber, and then there's some sort of point system to keep track of how much insulin you need based on how many carbs you've had. Well, a banana is going to be different than whole wheat bread, is going to be different than a potato, which is going to be different than rice at the level of the individual. And so knowing which specific carbs are going to spike your blood sugar versus not makes all the difference in the world. And the app currently compensates for that. And so you will see in some instances, a food is on your avoid list because it's going to spike your blood sugar.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. We've got questions here just on whether you should stop taking supplements or probiotics, and I think they might have missed that. But just a short on the supplements and taking any probiotics is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, that you can continue taking them, especially if it's something that you do on a regular basis, because it's important to see, with those, how is your gut functioning? Rob, as you said, if it's an ongoing thing, there's no reason to stop them if that's part of your regimen and what you take on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And I'll say this too, for anybody who's curious if their probiotics are working, if we see that those probiotics become active in your microbiome, they get tagged in the app. So you can see if the strains you're taking are actually colonizing.
So then how does this affect your weight and following the recommendations? Would you see serious weight fluctuations by following them?
We've seen a woman, you've heard me tell this story 100 times. We had a woman in the last 18 months who was 400 pounds, scheduled for a gastric bypass surgery, unable to lose weight on an 800 calorie per day diet. They had to cancel the surgery for the stomach staple and got connected with us through a trial, followed the food recommendations for 3 months and was down 70 pounds. Kept it going for another 3 months and she was down 180 pounds. And I think today she's down 210 pounds. So we have absolutely seen weight loss is, again, one of the top 3 things that people get out of following the food recommendations. I don't necessarily think I've heard of anybody going the opposite direction, but I mean, we've done, hundreds of thousands of people, so I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Great. And Rob, a question here is, what if you've had a gastric bypass operation? Would that have an effect on your test? Yeah. Can you still be tested if you've had that?
You can absolutely still be tested, and I'm sure that it would have some impact on the overall microbiome, but my understanding of that surgery is it is a volume limiting surgery. And it's also in the upper GI tract, significantly far away from the microbiome. So if it impacts the way that you eat and your diet changed to accommodate that, that's probably also going to change the microbiome. But by no means does it disqualify you from doing a test or invalidate what you would see on the test.
Absolutely not, yes. And then Rob, how does the test pick up intolerances or reactions that you might have to certain foods? So when you do the test, could it pick up an intolerance that you might have had to a food that you ate recently? And does it pick up more specifically, is it skewed by things that you may have eaten recently, basically? I think that's the question.
So I'm actually surprised it took us this long to get to that one. That's everybody's first question. So when we think about a food allergy, what that really means is that food is getting into the bloodstream and triggering your immune cells to attack as though there's a pathogen in the system. Now that can be a function of your immune system not functioning properly, or it can be an effect of you have leaky gut and too much food particles that should not be entering the bloodstream are getting into the bloodstream. What we're looking at Viome, I guess, is separate from that. We're looking at what microbes do you have, what is the quality or the strength of your gut lining and your digestive efficiency, and how is your microbiome behaving? And if we can improve that and we can strengthen the gut lining and decrease inflammation, we may in fact be able to improve food sensitivities or remove food allergies. Whereas if you do a food allergy test, the only option you have is to then avoid that food forever. Like you can't actually fix anything. I am blanking on what the other part of your question was as it relates to food sensitivity.
I think you've pretty much answered it. Basically just looking at how does what you've eaten affect your sample, right?
Oh, and actually, I do remember what the other part was. So if you're eating something right now, will it impact whether or not it looks like you have a food allergy? If let's say that you're eating a tremendous amount of broccoli, which is a high sulfate food, you may produce a lot of sulfide, which would then throw off your sulfide score as we look at it. And we may say minimize the broccoli for a little bit. Like you're taxing the system by feeding it too much of this. So not necessarily a food allergy, but certainly can impact the scores if you're overeating something.
Brilliant. And I think we're definitely running out of time, so I'm just going to ask maybe one or two more questions. So there's a question here: is there an association between the microbiome and diseases? So any particular things in the microbiome and certain diseases? And we've also got a question here: is doing Viome beneficial for someone that has cystic fibrosis or perhaps someone with low iron? So maybe you can just talk to the association with diseases and could it help with that?
Sure. So in terms of can training the microbiome overall help with disease? Actually, can you give me the first question one more time? I was trying to keep track in my head of the.
Oh, sorry. So just the association between particular things on the microbiome and disease. So particular.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would think of it less as, do I have a particular bacteria that then leads to a disease? And I would think of it more as, what are my microbes doing and what are they producing that can lead to disease. So I'll give you an example. LPS, which is one of our scores, lipopolysaccharide, is a highly inflammatory molecule, and it's fairly large, so it should not actually be able to pass into the bloodstream or through the gut lining. But when you look at people with Alzheimer's, they have 3 times as much LPS in the brain as healthy individuals. When you look at Parkinson's, you see the same thing. When you look at individuals with particular cancers like breast cancer, you see copious amounts of LPS in the breast. And so what the microbiome is producing, what these byproducts and these inflammatory things that get made, if they enter into the rest of the body, they can absolutely have an impact on disease.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And then maybe just one last question. Do hormone changes impact the microbiome? Would changing or stopping contraceptives change your test results? And maybe I can just add in, does it have any effects on fertility?
So what's fascinating about
question to end off with.
Yes, hormones and the microbiome intricately connected. I'll give you an example of the vaginal microbiome, which will eventually, hopefully in the next year, be able to have a test for. Vaginal microbiome is, from a diversity standpoint, not very diverse, and it has a lot of lactobacillus, which produces lactic acid to create a acidic environment for that space, because what it doesn't want to happen is other microbes to come in that could set up camp and screw up fertility. When you get rid of lactobacillus in that microbiome, you see massive drops in fertility rates and a spike in fertility issues. And actually, after menopause, you see the lactobacillus almost disappear from the vaginal microbiome. So there is clearly a connection between the microbes you have, how they're functioning, and fertility, and certainly with hormones. So lactobacillus also, if you get rid of that in a young individual, you see their estrogen levels change. So yes, the bottom line is any changes to hormones or any changes to the microbiome, those two will impact each other.
Good to know. Thank you, Rob. And maybe one to end off with, I'm not too sure if you'll know the answer to this, but what is the effect of hand sanitizers on the microbiome? I think quite a topical question at the moment.
It is terrible. As somebody who has been drowning himself in hand sanitizer since this thing began, I do know that it is terrible, and I'm a little concerned when I see videos of China with drones spraying hand sanitizer into the streets, because when you effectively sterilize the environment, it's like taking all of the plant life out of your front yard. Weeds will occur, and then there's nothing to keep those weeds in check, and then they can just take over. So hand sanitizer absolutely has a decreasing effect on overall diversity, which is not generally great for your health.
But I suppose at the same time also, unfortunately, quite necessary right now. So
that is the reality, and I continue to walk with it in my pocket. So knowing that has not stopped me, because it's a risk reward type thing.
Maybe we'll all just be doing a test a bit more frequently.
That might have to be the solution. Yeah. Or playing the dirt more after this thing's over. I don't know.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Rob. There were a couple of questions that we didn't get to, which I'm very sorry, but what we'll do is we will send you an email with the answers to your questions if we didn't get to them. But Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to answer a whole list of questions from our listeners tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, I think, so thanks to Rob, and thank you to everyone for sending through your questions. And I hope this has been beneficial for everyone.
Awesome. Shelly, thanks so much. And anything that popped up that we didn't get to, shoot me an email, and myself or the science team can certainly get back to you on that.
Will do. Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.